I'm Amy Halpern Laff.
And I'm John Moscow. Welcome to Ethical Schools. Our guest today is Harry Feder, Executive Director of FairTest, a nonprofit that advocates for equitable and transparent educational testing. Harry came to FairTest after a long career in public education in New York City as both a teacher and researcher. This is part one of a two-part interview. Today we'll discuss college admissions tests, specifically the SAT. In part two, we'll focus on high-stakes tests in K through 12. Welcome, Harry.
Hi, John. Hi, Amy. Nice to be here.
Would you tell us a little about the history of college admissions testing?
Well, it goes back about a century with the invention of the SAT, which was derived from Binet intelligence tests used to sort officers for the army in World War I to make sure that we don't have too many Southern Europeans and Black people in the officer corps. And then there's a lot been written about this. I recommend folks check out Nick Lehman's writing, for example. I'll plug, he's got a new book coming out about the SAT in September, Princeton University Press, that promises to be good. And there was an idea that upper elite, in quotes, Ivy League education was sort of an old boys network, and it wasn't capturing some of our best and brightest. And so Conant at Harvard and others wanted to create a test that would actually sort of capture folks based on merit. Of course, over time, that test proved to have its own cultural and racial biases. So this is sort of in the post-World War II era. Well, no, I guess a little bit before that, around World War II. So I'm not 100%. Don't quote me. I'd have to go back to the readings to get all the dates right and stuff like that. Then the ACT was the competitor to the SAT. And originally it was actually the SAT was created by the Educational Testing Service, which came out of folks from the Ivy League that sort of tried to create this test where you could compare people from all around the country. And so you do selective college admissions that way. And then the ACT and the SAT basically became the coin of the realm. The ACT tended to be more of a Midwest thing, but now it's sort of spread to be, I would probably a competitor to the SAT, at least in the college admissions realm. The College Board, the running of the SAT then at one point shifted from ETS to the College Board. The College Board is a member organization, a putative non-for-profit whose CEO makes over $2 million a year. And they administer the SAT, which is now gone digital. So it's now brand new. So it is now a sort of shorter, more flexible exam. And I was just listening to something. And also what is on the test has changed over time. On the verbal section, there used to be something called analogies, but, yacht is to mainmast, as that proved to not kind of fly so well. So they got rid of that for obvious reasons, because those relationships and words really had cultural biases baked in. It's also what we call a norm reference test. So the scoring of it is on a bell curve. There's a big middle and people who get at the very high end and the very low end are fewer. And that's through the exercises in psychometrics, they set the scores and how many you have to get right in order to. Now, it's interesting, this new SAT, which we can talk about a little bit later maybe, is an adaptive test, but it's stage adaptive. So if you get X right on the first part of a section, you will go to one second part. If you get Y right on that section, you go to a different second part. So the kinds of questions you get right will determine your score, not just sort of the number of questions you get right, if that makes sense. And of course, hard, how do we know when a question is hard versus a question is easy? We know it by the number of people who get it right or wrong. Right? It's sort of a psychometric self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's kind of the history of it. It is originally essentially was a race class filterer. Then there was an idea that we need to bring in more smart people into higher academia, Jews. But then, of course, there became too many Jews. But it over time very much became a class and race sorter, as it were.
So what does the SAT purport to test, and what does it actually test?
Your guess is as good as mine. No, but I'm not. I'm only half joking. The College Board and the ACT will make the claim that it is a predictor of freshman year grades in college, and thus it purports to, through some miracle, it purports to indicate who will do well, at least in the beginning of college. That's all it purports to do. It is not, they used to call it, the SAT, it used to stand for scholastic aptitude. So there was this idea that it was a kind of intelligence test, but they've sort of gone away from that idea. What does it actually test? It tests, now let's be very clear, it's in a timed setting. So the one thing it does test is speed. They would say processing speed. I would just say sort of, the ability to move through things quickly or at a certain speed. It tests, some math, algebra, some basic geometry, sort of not like the highest level high school math, I would say. I mean, some of the harder questions have some trig and stuff on it. So it does test math and sort of logic. Now, it used to have a lot more kind of, it had gone to some verbal math problems, but the new, leaner computer version, actually, that's decreased, interestingly. That's an interesting change, because that was a big complaint, rightfully so, for English language learners. Like, I know how to do math, I just don't understand the paragraph well. So now they're more just sort of pure math problems, solve for X or whatever. And then the verbal section, there is grammar and composition, and then there's reading comprehension. There used to be these analogies and stuff like that. They got rid of that. So the test has changed a bit over time. For a while, there was a writing component. Now there isn't. Sort of optional. The ACT has a science section, which is more like interpreting graphs. And so that's interesting. It sort of gives the ACT an interesting little leg up in being used for ESSA accountability purposes, because ESSA meaning the
Every Student
Succeeds Act.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Replacement of No
Child Left Behind. It was the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. Thank you. So that is what is on it. And so I don't know exactly what it tests. So it does test some reading. It does test some reading comprehension, find the main idea here, the author means, that kind of stuff. And it tests math, some problem solving in math. What skills does it test? It obviously, because it was 3 hours, now it's closer to 2, it tests how fast you can do all this, which I don't know that that's actually the mark of success either in school or in life. I mean, there have been studies that have tried to sort of correlate SAT scores to future income and things like that. But it's hard to factor out like who your parents were. And also like college graduation, it has some correlation to that, but not as good of a correlation as high school grades. So really it's first year grades that's the main claim.
I have a couple of questions from what you just said, both of which are probably pretty obvious. But when you were talking about the math, I was thinking about all of the fights that are going on about algebra and who takes it and when they take it and so on. So it really does measure, among other things, what opportunities students have had in terms of their school curriculum. So that if students haven't had an opportunity to take algebra, or if they took algebra but later on, so they didn't get a chance.
Well, I mean, I think sort of that's less of a problem with the SAT than that problem rears its head in college admissions with sort of the calculus expectancy, if you will, right? Because the problem is if kids don't take algebra before the ninth grade, then it tends to be difficult for them in the current math sequence to be on track to take calculus before they graduate high school. And lots of schools view calculus as, particularly for anything in the STEM field, right, and the taking of calculus as an indicator of whether you're ready for college level math. There's a group called Just Equations. I want to talk to those people if you're interested in this topic, that really have focused and drilled down on the inequities in math education and how we do math education. I mean, I could go on about math education. I think like the focus in high school on calculus is preposterous. I think if you're going to be an engineer or maybe even or an economist, maybe you need calculus. And it does, there's a beauty in calculus, and it certainly gives you a certain mind training. But I'd say your average citizen needs to understand probability and statistics a lot more than it needs to understand calculus. And
so it's less of a problem with the SAT itself.
Yeah, because the stuff on the SAT tends to be algebra 1 and geometry. And even if now, look, there's always like the quality of the school and the quality of the teaching generally. But pretty much all high school math gets to algebra and geometry if you're actually doing math.
Right. So the other question I had was in terms of reading. I know obviously there's been lots of criticisms of many standardized tests on the idea that you're just getting these little out of context paragraphs and stuff. Mm-hmm. Is that an issue with the SAT, and is it something that they have to address?
Well, I mean, the passages. What's interesting is the SAT now, the claim they make is it's better because the passages are shorter. Like they're really short now. And they're fewer in the new version, in the newest version, in the online version. And so, you barely have to have the stamina to read anything anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe that's a genuine reflection of the requirements of society. If you can post on Twitter and read a Twitter post, you're good. What that does to our capacity to think deeply and to function as a economically vibrant democracy, I argue that that's a problem. But even in the old one, where the passages were longer, I mean, you're right, John. I think they tended to be about sometimes esoteric things. I think the College Board and the ACT both try to responded to some of those criticisms and have tried to find things that are, I have not in a long time, done an analysis of what's actually in these passages and what's on them. It's interesting. There's an article in Mother Jones, and I went through and read the classical learning test, which is supposed to be a competitor to the SAT. It's the one in Florida. It's supposed to be we want kids to read Plato, which frankly, I wish they read Plato. But the test is still the same thing like the SAT, except the passage is about, nuns. No, there was one about nuns, which I think if you went to Catholic school, you probably had a little bit of a leg up on that passage. But there was also a passage from one of the Federalist Papers which I don't know that the critique, is the SAT has become woke because you'll get a passage about God knows what, something written by Toni Morrison. That's unfair because the classical learning test had Toni Morrison as one of the approved authors. So I think that you're right that that is an issue that is a constant struggle for the test designers. I think what they've done is they've basically said, oh, those passages were too long anyway. So now they can't be more than, 50 words or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Serious.
So, Harry, over several years, many of these colleges went test-free or test optional. Which universities took that route, and what impact did that have on who got in?
Sure. Well, that's a big question. So there had been a movement, a small one, probably starting in like the 90s, among some small liberal arts places like Bowdoin, for example, was a sort of leading proponent of test optional policies. And then some larger schools like Wake Forest joined. So there were several hundred schools from, let's say, the 90s to the 2010s that looked at what they were getting with the test, saw that the test really was not necessarily getting them anything beyond what looking at grades and other stuff would get them in their class, and was perhaps an inhibitor of creating a socioeconomically and racially diverse class, because the data from these standardized tests show that the one thing that the SAT scores correlate fabulously to is family income. And also there is a big disparate impact in terms of performance by race, with Asians and whites performing on average several points higher than Blacks and Latinos. And so that's baked. Now, there was some studies done years ago that showed that, when they picked items, if Blacks and tended to score better than whites, those test items weren't put in the test, but the items, because they would give the experimental section. I think that they've seen the light on that particular item response problem. So now, really though, but the College Board's own data sort of shows that. So there were those schools. And so there was like a movement, as it were. Then like 2017, 2018, U of Chicago was, I think, a big, of the Ivy pluses, they were the first to sort of, because that's who we think of as sort of leading the way here, even though 90% of all schools in America are not particularly selective at all and take most applicants. So we're really talking about entry into my colleague Akil Bello coined the term, the highly rejective schools. And that gets used, but we won't poke the bear. I'll call them selective. And so those schools were the ones that sort of were. So once U of Chicago went, people started thinking, oh, whoa, do we really need, what do these tests really give us? I think U of Chicago had a little bit of the philosophy is, what's a 2.5 hour, 3 hour, one sitting test going to tell us about a kid's intellectual capacity or capacity to do this work? It seems like a little strange because it's certainly not a test of deeper thinking, right? So you ask, John, what does this test actually test? And that's why I say, does it really test what you're supposed to do at a high level college? I don't think so. It's just bought because of this correlation that there is data for. We just don't know why it correlates necessarily. But anyway, getting back to the history of it. So, and then we have COVID, right? And also, let me take a step back. The University of California system was undergoing an audit to see what these tests actually do to admissions, in part because, California had this ban on affirmative action before the US Supreme Court ever stepped into the fray. And the numbers at particularly the upper tier of the UC system, UCLA, Berkeley, and those right below it, I don't know, Santa Barbara, Irvine, the other UCs. It's not what the public university was supposed to be about. It wasn't taking in the population of California, the representative population of California. And so there was a move to get rid of the SAT, and then COVID hit and nobody could take the SAT. And so lots of schools, and now, and I will still say, and we'll talk about the revanchists, I will call them, who have kind of gone back to it. Lots of schools said, we're not going to give them because it's hard for kids to take them. We're going to use a more holistic picture of the student. And the University of California system, after an internal debate, there was a faction that said, no, we have to have them. They correlate to success in college. And then there was another faction, and I would say led by, but the data was provided by the principal researcher for the UC system, a guy named Saul Geiser. And we said, well, the problem with the study you're saying that it correlates is it suffers from omitted variable bias. You are actually not accounting for race and income. And when you do that, grades are the best predictor of success by a lot. And you don't need the test. High school grades, that is. So California then made a decision for egalitarian reasons and equity reasons, but understanding that they weren't really going to lose anything in terms of quality. And there's been a lot of studies about this that we could talk about later. They said, no test at all. Don't put it on. You put it on, we're going to reject you if you try to sneak it in. I actually heard the UCLA admissions person say that. So they went test free, the entire UC system, in 2019, 20, I forget the exact year, but around COVID. And they are maintaining that policy. Other schools went test optional, and they went test optional. Some of them went for a trial period. Others have declared they're permanently test optional. The numbers are over 2,000 undergraduate degree conferring institutions, four-year institutions in the United States, which represents about 90% of all of them, are now test optional or test free. And that data is on our website, fairtest.org. We maintain the go-to test optional list. Yeah, John, you were on it.
Well, I was just going to say that you started to refer to some of the schools that seem to be reversing course.
We will call them revanchists, yes.
The revanchists. So which schools are doing this and why?
And why? So I would say I'll do it in sort of three tranches. One is sort of some big public Southern systems, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, mostly, although they also have a way you can get into the University of Tennessee if you're like in the top X% of your class. So for locals, it had a little bit less impact, at least at that level. But anyway, they basically said, test is a test, and it's, we didn't want to go away from them anyway. This is how we do this in our, and a lot of scholarships. This is an interesting thing also, are tied to test scores. So Florida has something called, I think it's Bright Minds state scholarships, and they're tied to test scores, and they're, supposed to be designed to allow low income kids and kids of color to attend the major public universities. Of course, because they're hooked on test scores, it has the effect of being kind of disproportionately rewarding those who need the money less to get into. So and we have something on our website. We have a report about that on even in places where they made it test optional for entry, these scholarships sometimes in the state system get tied to test scores. And there's a lot of hidden scholarships that are tied to SAT and ACT scores. Second is a couple of the big tech schools went back early, MIT and Purdue, Georgia Tech being the sort of three. Caltech has also now gone back to requiring tests, but they were test free for a little while longer. and I'll just use MIT as the example, what they say is, look, we have internal data that tells us that SAT and ACT scores, particularly on the math section, are an indicator of whether kids can handle the work at MIT. That if they get below a 700 or 650 on the math section, our internal data shows that they don't graduate in as great numbers those who score above it. So that was their rationale. Then the third, which is sort of the one that gets all the press, thanks to the New York Times, is some of the more highly rejective schools. It started with Dartmouth, I believe, and then Harvard. Since then, Harvard and Yale and Brown have reinstituted the SAT as a standardized test requirement. Other Ivies, Columbia declared itself permanently test optional. So even among the elite Ivy, Princeton is still on the fence. Penn is pretty solid in the test optional camp right now. So even University of Michigan declared itself to be test optional for the foreseeable future, like the same day as Yale, but Yale got a lot more press because it went in the direction that the New York Times wanted it to go. And, you ask why. Now, the stated reason is that SATs, they found in their internal data that SAT scores are a better predictor of college success than grades. They also stated that they need the SAT scores to find poor students and students of color from places that aren't Dalton, Harvard, Westlake, or the feeder schools to the Ivy Leagues, so we can find them, find these kids, find the kid from Biloxi, Mississippi, who gets a 1550 on the SAT. And then we will offer them entry because we know that they can succeed here. And there's a study that was relied upon by a group led by a Harvard economist, Raj Chetty, who does a lot of work, and John Friedman of Brown, who basically said that kids who should have been submitting under a test optional policy, who got maybe a 1400, but came from an underprivileged Black neighborhood in Dallas or whatever, didn't submit because they didn't think it was good enough, but they should have, and they might have gotten it. So that's the rationale. Now, there are a lot of problems with this, of course, because as soon as you require the test, essentially you're going to filter out more kids who just won't apply. And John, you asked, what has been the impact of test optional policies and test-free policies? Applications have gone up. I don't know what the exact numbers are in terms of percentages, but I know like that UCLA, for example, now gets 150,000 applications. I mean, their application pool went up by like a third at least. And the people who are submitting are lower socioeconomic folks, Black and brown folks. And if you look at, it's a little bit rich because when the Ivy League said, well, we need the tests to find the qualified minorities. If you look at their data, when they required the test, their diversity numbers in the days where affirmative action was allowed were not so hot. Mm-hmm. And for the 2 or 3 years that they used test optional policies, those diversity numbers either stayed the same or got a little better. So I think they speak with forked tongue. I think what they should say is, look, we are self-proclaimed elite institutions. We have standards. We think the SAT is a marker of intellectual ability, of success in academic work, and thus we want to use it. And if you want to come to one of our places, you got to take it and we got to see what you can do. And if they had said that, they would at least have been honest, as opposed to sort of cloaking their elitism, for want of a better word, in the patina of equity, because it ain't equity.
Right. So, Harry, if our goal is not just more equitable college admissions, but a more ethical and democratic society. What other changes in the admissions process need to be made?
Okay, that's interesting because here's some of the changes that the Ivies are not doing that the Opportunity Insights report showed that would change.
That's the Chetty report, right?
The Chetty, yeah, the Opportunity Insights is Chetty, yeah. Chetty et al., we'll call it. So the first thing it found was that the Ivy Plus schools, and why are we concerned about Ivy Plus schools? Why? Because when you look at leadership, right? And you know, they have what is success? Success is working at major firms, working at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. So the measures of success used in the study are absolutely, right, those in the 1% of elite leadership, you know, members of Congress, members of the federal judiciary. Appeals are higher, of course, trial court. Anybody can become a trial court judge. No, I'm joking. That's a joke. And, you know, Kinsey, Boston, I don't know which consulting groups made the cut. Investment banks, obviously, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, yada, yada, yada. Those were measures of success. And if you look at that group, they are overwhelmingly members of the Ivy Plus schools, maybe plus another 10 or 15, you know, the NYUs of the world now, or USC or whatever, who've kind of also in that top 30 or whatever. And so that's our measure of success. And so it is like this sort of massive ranking and sorting. So that how do the Ivy Plus, however, if you look at the socioeconomics of the kids who are in it, they are overwhelmingly from like the top 10% of wealthy households in America. And particularly the top like 1% or the top 0.1. Like if you compare the top 1%, I don't remember the numbers, but there are as many kids from the top 1% as there are from like the bottom 60% or something like that. So, you know, if you really want to see how they're doing on equity, look at how many Pell Grant kids they have. And it ain't so good for the most part. Some schools are making genuine progress in this area, but those policies have nothing to do with testing. It's about outreach. It's about kind of giving money. The school, Johns Hopkins is a very interesting example of that, how they've basically changed the composition of their incoming classes over the last 5 to 10 years. It's purposeful. So what does Opportunity say? Why does it look like this? 3 big drivers. 1, legacy admissions, for obvious reasons. 2, sports scholarships. Now, balloons. Balloons pop up during sports. I'm sorry, this is audio and the Zoom just gave balloons. I'm not quite sure why.
Your answers.
What? They like my answers.
Yeah. Like your answers.
Yeah. Sports. When I talk about sports, I mean squash, lacrosse. Both like prep school country club sports for the most part. We're not talking just about the basketball and the football scholarships here. And those kids are disproportionately wealthy because they've gone to the camps, they've gone to all the stuff that, you know. And then the third thing is kind of the padding of the resume with fancy internships and the New York Times program and the semester in Cambridge and all that stuff. Right. But of course, the SAT, anybody can take the SAT. Now, have they gotten rid of legacy admissions or squash? No. Of course not. We're going to focus on, we need the test back so we can get these kids in. But if they got rid of those other 2, there'd be a lot more space for a lot more lower income kids. So that's why I say they speak with forked tongue. As far as the sport, the country club sports and all the extracurricular opportunities, unlike a standardized test, which the number is the number and it's baked in. And yes, you can say a 1400 when you coming from a poor family in rural Idaho is as least a good an indicator as a 1600 from Scarsdale, right? Which is for those of your listeners who don't know, is a wealthy suburb of New York City. Yes, but the problem then becomes that when Ed Blum brings his discrimination suit and says, look, the only objective measure we have is this test score, right? And you've let in the 1400s over the 1600s. So I'm not quite sure why the general councils of these Ivy League schools have sort of let them go down this road. But maybe it's because they just don't care. I don't know. Taking one step back, whereas I can make the argument that I have two kids here. One worked at the 7-Eleven after school for 5 hours a night, and the other got cello lessons from Yo-Yo Ma. Now, Ivy League faculty might have more in common with the cellist who studied with Yo-Yo Ma and might find that more interesting. But certainly in the admissions office, I think you can kind of weigh those two things and make a decision about who might need this Yale education a little more, or whose perspective and experience, you talk about democratic society, would benefit from the finishing of Yale into higher leadership in America. Would we best be served by having a broader swath of socioeconomic experience in our leadership class, right? As opposed to recycling the same plutocracy over and over again. And so there's your answer for democracy, right? Because the policies we get are born of the experience of our leadership class.
Yeah. I just had one question.
That's why this shit's important. I'm sorry, because it seems, sometimes I think, why do I do this? I mean, it's a test score. College admissions, kids go to college, they don't go to college. Everybody, as long as the broad macroeconomics and political kind of framework of our society are okay, it doesn't matter. People find happy lives. But the sad truth is, right, it does impact both how our economy is structured and now increasingly how our democracy is dysfunctional, because certainly our politics have been corrupted by money. So, yeah, I think like how we and who populates our universities really matters.
Yeah, that makes an enormous amount of sense. I just have one more question, which is actually going back, which is that one of the arguments that we hear a lot about why you can't rely on grades being a better indicator is this thing about grade inflation. And I was just curious what your response to that is.
Well, where is the grade inflation happening? The grade inflation is happening, at Dalton or Harvard Westlake or whatever, because there's all sorts of pressure on the teachers and the counselors to make their kids look good for the colleges, right? So I would suggest that, and it's the grade inflation is not happening, or is certainly, they have a lot of catching up to do anyway, in terms of grade inflation at your local public high school in a poorer neighborhood. And also, grade inflation just means the kind of the margins of comparison are a little tighter. It's not that there is no differentiation in grade scale. It's just the differentiation has sort of moved up the chain a little bit. So what used to be a C is now a B. So I don't think that that's a justification. The truth of the matter is, and we have these studies on a report on our website, that the data on grades is historically over decades been really good as the best indicator. And it makes complete sense because you're looking at a kid over the course of time as opposed to over the course of 2 hours. And over the course of time, you get a sense of kind of not just the kid's intellect, but the kid's work habits. The other thing we could look at, for example, is what they call discrepant scores, which is SATs overperforming grades or SATs underperforming grades. What's the biggest class of kids where the SATs overperform grades? It's mostly white guys, with all due respect to myself. Underperforming, it's women and minorities, where the discrepants are the SATs underperforming grades. So that tells you something about the tests themselves, but it also tells you, study after study, going back to, the 90s, there's a book by the former president of Princeton, William Bowen, studies that they did saying, look, grades are the best predictor over time of how kids do in college. Because also the predictive power of SATs dissipates over the time in college. It's most predictive in your freshman year. By the time you get to senior year, it loses its predictive power, which makes complete sense because the kids who maybe learned how to do school, right, over 4 years, the kids who didn't have the best high school experience. And, what is college there for? Is it there to just educate the anointed, or is it there to kind of educate people who are willing to be educated? And I would argue it should be the latter. And if we conceive of society more along the lines of the way we conceived it, with the exception of our racial blindness, but the way we conceived it from World War II to 1980, maybe, there were basically trying to make life better and to educate more people, as opposed to funneling people into select meritocracy that will now rule over us. We've shifted our philosophy, and perhaps, the curve needs to move back in the other direction. And I hope it's not too late. I hope we're not kind of, doomed to authoritarian populism. But even in India yesterday, it seems like, Modi's losing his mojo a little bit.
Well, thank you, Harry Feder of FairTest. We'll look forward to having you back next time to talk about the ethical implications of high-stakes testing in K through 12.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you, listeners. Check out our new video series, What Would You Do? A collaboration with the Harvard Graduate School of Education and edEthics. Go to our website, ethicalschools.org, and click video. The goal of the series is not to provide right answers, but to illustrate a variety of ethical viewpoints. If you found this podcast worthwhile, please share it with a friend or colleague. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and give us a rating or review, because this helps others to find the show. Check out our website for more episodes and articles, and subscribe to our monthly emails. We post annotated transcripts of our interviews to make them easy to use in workshops or classes. And you can contact us at hosts@ethicalschools.org. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube. Our editor and social media manager is Amanda Denchi. Until next week.
Thank you.